Hi everyone, welcome. I've got these two systems out here on the bench. I'm preparing to check in on them. They're, as you might be able to tell just from the orientation of things in the bins, they're set up for migrating the worms out of their finished castings into these horizontal migration feeding zones. But before I position the camera overhead, I just wanted to point out an observation I made here, which is this whole bunch of deposited castings on the side of this bin right here. This is evidence of worms crawling up the side of the bin and then I'm assuming out of the bin, plopping down probably into some of the bins that were right beneath, which just happened to be also the same type of worm that live in these systems. So what was positioned right underneath where this bin was, which was right over there in that vacant spot on the shelf, was those two black bins, which also have European night crawlers in them. So these two European night crawler bins have been sitting around here for 12 days now since the most recent check-in, and that was the last time we replenished the food supply in these systems. And I assume that the migration is probably still underway, so I wanted to just replenish the food again. The plan is more or less identical to last time, which is to just give them stuff that should be easy for them to eat, which is coffee, used coffee, as well as some of my worm chow here, a little bit that I've got left. Gonna have to make some more soon. But before we replenish the feeding supply in the horizontal migration feeding zones, I'd like to also do another thing that I think is pretty key to seeing the action that I'm anticipating here, which is the movement of the worms out of their finished castings, which is to further aid in the drying of the material that I'd like to see them leave. Because I've got a theory about them leaving their finished castings, which is that they're very unlikely to do so as long as the material is still completely damp, like this stuff over here is. And after 24 days of migrating, you would think that this stuff would have shown a little bit more progress in terms of being depopulated. But you could see that the worms are still all over this stuff. I've not been back into these bins since we were in here together to shoot the last video, which was 12 days ago. I'm starting to wonder if there might be some benefit to me popping in here occasionally. Perhaps a few just off video check-ins just to quickly aerate the material occasionally to further help with the drying. Because until this stuff starts to dry a little bit more, I believe the chances of us seeing a complete migration out of this material is fairly unlikely. So it does seem to me like, besides positioning some foods and fresh bedding for them in the horizontal migration feeding zone, another fairly important factor that contributes to a successful migration is that you have material which is somewhat drier than this which provides the worms with some motivation to go seeking out some material that's a little bit more to their liking, material that's nice and damp. Because the foods that I've been putting over there might be nice if the worms do wind up over there, and that they might stay over there if they encounter that supply of food. But what's going to motivate them to leave in the first place, right? As long as they're hanging out in material like this, which is completely damp and comfortable for them, they're just going to stay. So I'm trying to think if I've succeeded in bringing up all the material from down low. I think there might still be some. And yeah, you can see there's lots and lots of worms in here still. I mean, I know that last time too, when we checked in here and we looked through the horizontal migration feeding zone and we added some more food, even then we already saw that there was already a pretty decent turnout in the horizontal migration feeding zones. But we're clearly nowhere near done. In fact, a lot of people might look at this material and say, geez, have you even started? And yes, 24 days in progress of trying to lure the worms out of this finished material, but it's still just too darn cozy for them, being as damp as it is. Until we start to see a little bit more drying, I'm afraid that this is really all we're gonna see here, is just worms continuing to camp out in the stuff and not have a great deal of motivation to leave. Got some info here, just really quick. I already mentioned a couple things that are detailed here, which is the fact that it was 12 days since we last checked in, and it was 12 days prior to that we actually initiated the horizontal migration. So 24 days in progress. I guess the only other bit of information that's of interest here is the age, and if you do some quick math in your head and you add 7 days to the age of these bins, you'll see that the systems are now just 1 week away from hitting 1 year of age. And I believe that it's going to be at that point, 1 week from today, that I'm going to come back into these systems and do the haul out, the first haul out of the worms out of the horizontal migration feeding zones, to launch off a couple new systems. The material that I've got for them has been sort of aging and priming and getting sort of seasoned for the past 13 days. So a week from today, it will have been 20 days that the material that I'm going to be moving them into, some fresh bedding of shredded paper, cardboard, and leaves, will have been sort of preparing for the new inhabitants. And I do have a couple of bins that I've managed to prepare for them. So kind of at that point where even if I wanted to do it today, I probably could, but I figured I would just wait a little bit longer. We're going to go another week, I believe. And, you know, look at all those springtails. Springtails seem to be happening in a lot of my systems lately. I'm not sure why. Look at this freshly prepared divider, cardboard divider over here that I whipped up fresh for them 12 days ago during the last check-in, has once again succumbed to the same fate as its predecessor did, which is being nibbled away through the hip by worms traversing through it from the finished castings over into the feeding zone. And I'm not sure if it's even necessary to fashion a replacement for this thing. I believe that we can probably just go with it as is. Over here you could see I had placed an additional piece of plastic paper bag over what had been originally covering up the horizontal migration feeding zones, which is this little chunk of bubble wrap. So I'm going to be adding a little bit more coffee down into here. And yeah, look at that. Springtails. Springtails, I don't know, I'm starting to turn into a springtail farmer here, not just a worm farmer. But let's see if we can get a sense of how the worms are coming together here in this feeding zone. We did not only pile in coffee for them last time with worm chow, but we also replenished the bedding supply. And it's so nice, the castings are so nice and fluffy and loose and not overly damp. Kind of makes me wonder if maybe there is just a lack of moisture over in this horizontal migration feeding zone, which might be contributing to the somewhat lackluster turnout. I mean, they've come over and they've fed on almost all of the bedding I threw down into here for them, as well as probably most of, if not all of, the coffee and worm chow I threw in there, but I don't see quite as many worms as I would expect to see over here. Huh. I see some leftovers too of what had been placed in here originally to stock up the horizontal migration feeding zone, which would have been cantaloupe melon rinds. So starting to wonder if the whole thing about using these dividers is even of any use, because the worms just nibble away at this stuff let's really quick do the same thing over here, is aerate the finished castings. See if we can contribute to the drying process a little bit. I mean, it's been so humid lately, and today it's especially humid. It's been a lot of rainy weather. Here's the stem of a banana. Just throw that into that feeding zone over there. So whenever there's a lot of humidity in the air, anything that's damp that would otherwise lose its moisture content to evaporation is unable to do so, just because of the moisture content that's already present in the air. And look at what's going on this one. Here it just seems like evidence of even less worm traffic, with this divider looking like it's hardly even seen anywhere. I mean, there's a big hole in the middle of it right there, but it's actually holding up incredibly well compared to the other system. And in the other system, at least, they've nibbled away at a good portion of it. In this one, it seems like they've hardly touched it, which would lead me to think that maybe there's hardly been any worms passing through it, making their way over into the horizontal migration feeding zone. So I'm not sure what to expect over here. I mean, I didn't do a whole lot of work over on this side aerating. I guess maybe just the curiosity got to me about what might be happening in the migration zone of this system. Here again, a whole bunch of really nice loose worm castings everywhere, but much drier than I would expect for a horizontal migration feeding zone. Huh. What to do, what to do. This is certainly not an example of, this is not like a shining example of what a horizontal migration feeding zone would look like if it was actually successfully luring and keeping the worms in it. Maybe worms are coming over to explore and find some food and nibble on it, perhaps chew up some of the bedding that was placed in here for them, but it also seems like they're just as happy to wander back out into the finished castings, quite possibly because it is more moist and damp over there, which always seems to be what the worms favor over anything else. Alright, well, I don't know what else to do here other than, you know, complete the task at hand as I had envisioned it, which is to simply add more bedding, add the food, and perhaps the one thing I could really do to increase the appeal of what's going on here is to bring in my water bottle and spray down the bedding nice and thoroughly so that there's a greater amount of moisture over here than there's been lately, which might actually result in a little bit more worm traffic than what we're seeing here. It's really the only thing that I think would really help improve matters here. Because, you know, a week from now, come hell or high water, I'm going to be doing the first haul out of worms from here, and it would be nice if we had a somewhat better turnout than what we're seeing here right now. And it does seem to me like the missing element here is water. I know an element is maybe like an element the way it's seen in ancient history. The element of water, although we know water is consisting of two elements, right? All right, let's just make this happen. Maybe we can just, as we're resetting, we could spend a little bit more time aerating the material over here in the first bin. So yeah, not quite what I was expecting. A little bit unfortunate, but what can you do? You just got to roll with it, you know. I suppose if I had air conditioning running in my house, the air in here would be a little bit drier, which would make things entirely different. And even my prepared bedding, which at times can be very damp, is a little bit drier than it normally would be. So bringing the spray bottle out here, I think, is going to make a good bit of difference. Getting everything over on this side in the horizontal migration feeding zones nice and damp does seem like the missing thing here. which might help us get things back on track. It almost seems like we even might have had more worms in the horizontal migration feeding zones last time, 24 days ago, than we're seeing now. And you know, by adding only coffee and worm chow to the feeding zones, and by adding only my prepared bedding, which maybe could have been a little bit more damp, maybe even then it was just a missed opportunity to just douse the entire thing with a little bit more moisture to make it more appealing for the worms to want to remain in once they come over to explore it. Because I'm sure that worms are just moving here and there and back and forth and throughout the whole system, exploring stuff all over the place. Just throw these in here too as supplementary additional bedding. Although, you know what? We should really introduce some water first. I'm not sure if the pressure, got a little bit of pressure in here still. I'm just going to go ahead and douse, I think, not only the freshly added stuff, but we might as well include some moisture down here in the stuff that's already part of the feeding zone. And then we'll add a little bit more bedding to both systems too, I believe. Get this little guy off the wall. Okay, let's give a similar treatment over here, and then we could bring in a little bit more bedding. And even though the water is coming out of here a little bit slow, I think that's okay. This thing does have the potential to dispense a pretty large amount of moisture quickly, but I'd rather do it in a somewhat more controlled fashion like it's doing here. Although I'm sure a couple pumps wouldn't hurt either, just to get the pressure up. Oops. Now, just a little bit more, I think. Oops, sorry. Just a little bit more bedding, I think, over here. Perhaps even introducing a somewhat larger chunk of bedding, and then a little bit more fragmented stuff. I mean, some might think that, hey, all the worms that you've got to accommodate in the horizontal migration feeding zone, if you think about it, you might be better off with a somewhat larger horizontal migration feeding zone. So perhaps the other thing here would be to not push everything back quite as much, and maybe even leave it a little bit more spacious, so that as worms come over, they don't feel so crowded in here. Although I think crowding is probably the least of our problems right now in the horizontal migration feeding zone, considering how many occupants we have in it right now, which is somewhat lackluster turnout. Let's definitely give a good bit of moisture to the freshly added bedding, which is somewhat dry right now. I guess next time I whip up another batch, I might need to include a little bit more moisture in it when I prepare it. Well, this might also be my, well, you know, we're going to be stirring around some more material that we haven't really completely aerated yet. So why don't we kind of leave it at that. And I believe that one thing we could do here is to kind of push it back, but not quite as far back as it had been, and maybe leaving it a little bit more spacious to allow for more worms to be in it without them feeling overly crowded. Just reusing whatever was already here and not worrying too much about replacing these tattered dividers. Well, this one's pretty tattered. The one in that bin's actually holding out quite good. And then over here, I think we've pretty thoroughly aerated the material throughout. So I think we can just backfill it and nudge it up against the divider so that the worms can access the feeding zone against a pretty good size area. But as long as we got humid weather, this material seems very unlikely to see much drying anytime soon. I mean, I'm sure it would over time release some of its moisture to evaporation. And maybe if it wasn't quite so deep, if it was spread out into, I don't know, into a greater surface area where the top surface can release a lot more and have the whole thing be less deep, maybe the whole thing would be able to dry off a little bit more readily. But right now this stuff just seems way too damp. And we're not giving our little wormies good motivation to seek out anything more interesting. So it might just be a waiting game. I mean, 24 days, if you think about what it took to complete the migration of the worms out of one of my other systems that I just finally finished the other day, it actually took 70 days. That's 70. So 24 days is still just a small fraction, less than half, not even half of the time it took to eventually see the material in that system dry out to the point where all the worms finally were inspired to exit the stuff. So who knows, we might be looking at another couple months before this stuff finally gets to that point where it's dried off enough to inspire our little worms to come together over in the migration zones of these two systems. So what else can we do? Sometimes it's a waiting game, and that's fine. I'm not in a hurry. Alright, I'm pretty sure we've succeeded in aerating all the material in both systems at this point. We've replenished the food supply. I'm just thinking, did I add worm chow? I might not have. Ooh, wow, that was quite a bit. And, you know, that's fine. I'm gonna have to make some more anyway. Let me just see if I can kind of blend this stuff in a little bit with the surrounding materials. And then I think we can start thinking about covering up and putting away. I hope we don't see more of this stuff like what we're seeing over here, these signs of worms exiting the material, or I mean exiting the bin. Exiting the material is what we want. We want them exiting their finished castings, but we don't want them exiting the bin. We don't want them jumping ship and ending up possibly in a place where they're just going to dry up and turn into jerky, right? We'd like to see them remain in their bins and be happy and healthy and not be trying to flee or whatever it is. I don't know. I doubt that it's curiosity, as a lot of people refer to certain behaviors of their worms implying that the worms are curious or they're adventurous or trying to gravitate towards something that they sense elsewhere in the room that's of more interest to them. I really don't think that's the case. I think the one thing that does inspire the worms, though, to get up and go is repulsion. And if something going on in this bin is causing that, this bin over here, it'd be nice to know what that was. There again, I couldn't tell you for sure that that's the explanation, because I don't know. Sometimes worms just do weird things. Stuff that I certainly can't explain entirely. I can only have theories. Alright everyone, got a few things I've got to take care of getting cleaned up and put away, but I'm not going to keep you around for that. That's boring. Before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.